In the spring of 1941, a 14-year-old girl from a small coal mining town in western Pennsylvania walked through the front doors of Coldwater State Hospital and did not walk back out again for 57 years. Her name was Edna Marsh. She was released in 1998, at the age of 71, into a world so changed from the one she'd left that she did not recognize a single street in the town where she'd been born. This is her story. Before we go further, if stories like this one matter to you, the kind that get buried under decades of silence until almost nobody remembers them, stick around, because what happened to Edna Marsh didn't begin with that front door in 1941, and it didn't end with her release in 1998 either. Drop a comment and tell me what year you're watching this from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Our story begins not in 1941, but in 1927, the year Edna Marsh was born, in a 3-room house on the back end of a company-owned street, in a town whose entire economy ran on a single coal seam 200 feet below the surface. Her father, Raymond Marsh, worked the mine the way every man on that street did, 6 days a week, coming home gray with coal dust, sitting down to dinner without saying much, and going to bed early enough to be back underground before most people had eaten breakfast. Her mother, Vera, kept the house and raised Edna and her 2 younger brothers with the particular combination of warmth and iron discipline that the women of that street seemed, almost universally, to have developed as their answer to the specific hardships of a coal town life. By every account that survives her childhood, and there are more than you might expect, because Edna's case eventually attracted enough attention that several researchers over the decades went looking for people who remembered her before 1941. She was a perfectly ordinary little girl, bright and sociable, known in her neighborhood for being quick with a laugh and good at remembering things. Her 3rd-grade teacher, interviewed in 1999 by a journalist writing about Edna's case following her release, remembered her as one of those children you notice, not because they cause trouble, but because they're simply more present somehow than the others. More there. She did well in school. She went to church with her mother every Sunday. She helped with her brothers. She was, by every surviving account, simply a child. A regular, unremarkable, ordinary child living a regular, unremarkable, ordinary life on the back end of a company-owned street in western Pennsylvania. And then, in the autumn of 1940, when Edna was 13 years old, her father Raymond was killed in a mining accident, a roof collapse in the lower seam, the same kind of accident that was, in that town, and in hundreds of towns like it across the coalfields, simply a known and accepted occupational risk, mourned, but not entirely unexpected, the way a certain kind of low-level ongoing catastrophe becomes part of the background texture of life, in a community where it happens often enough. Raymond Marsh was 38 years old when he died, and his death left Vera alone, with 3 children, no income beyond what the company's minimal survivor benefit provided, and a house that belonged to the company and would need to be vacated within 60 days. What happened to Vera Marsh in the months following Raymond's death is described, in the surviving records, in the clipped, clinical language that social welfare documentation of the early 1940s tended to use for situations that were, in fact, acute human crises. She was, by those records' account, unable to maintain independent household management following her husband's death, a phrase that almost certainly describes, in plain language, a woman who was in the grip of profound grief and possibly severe depression, without any meaningful support system, losing her home, trying to care for 3 children, in the middle of a winter in a coal town during the 2nd year of a world war. Several of the neighbors who were interviewed years later by researchers described Vera during this period in terms that make clear she was genuinely struggling in ways that went beyond ordinary grief. She stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping, stopped managing the household with the competence everyone had always associated with her. One neighbor recalled seeing her standing in the yard in January without a coat, staring at nothing, for long enough that the neighbor came outside to check on her. What the same neighbors also recalled, and what the surviving records largely corroborate, is that very little help was offered to Vera during this period, beyond a county welfare visit or two, and the eventual, apparently strongly encouraged, suggestion from a county social worker that her daughter Edna, her oldest child, 14 years old, her father dead 6 months, might benefit from evaluation at Coldwater State Hospital, which the social worker described, according to one neighbor's recollection of what Vera told her at the time, as a place that could help a girl who'd been through what she'd been through. Edna's commitment record, filed in March of 1941, lists her diagnosis as adolescent emotional instability and feeble-mindedness. The evaluation supporting that diagnosis, based on the records that survive, consisted of a single clinical interview lasting approximately 40 minutes. There is no surviving neurological or psychological testing in her file. There is no second opinion documented, and her mother Vera, according to a letter found decades later in the records that will become important to this story, signed the commitment papers believing, she wrote, that she was agreeing to a period of evaluation and treatment that would last perhaps a few months until Edna is more herself again. Vera Marsh did not understand, when she signed those papers in March of 1941, that she was signing her 14-year-old daughter into an institution from which, under the laws and practices of the time, release required a formal petition to the state board, a process that, in practice, almost nobody successfully navigated, because almost nobody tried. Because once a patient was inside a facility like Coldwater, the assumption of the entire system was that they belonged there, essentially indefinitely, unless someone on the outside pushed hard enough and long enough to prove otherwise. Nobody pushed, not then. The first few months of Edna's time at Coldwater are documented in a set of intake and early assessment notes that, while sparse, paint a picture consistent with what her neighbors described. A girl who was grieving her father, frightened by her new surroundings, and entirely confused about why she was there or when she would be going home. A nurse's note from June of 1941, 3 months after admission, describes Edna as cooperative but distressed, frequently asking after her family, resistant to accepting her placement as permanent. The same note characterizes this resistance, in the clinical language of the era, as evidence of impaired insight into her condition, meaning that Edna's entirely understandable and accurate belief that she didn't belong at Coldwater was itself being used, in her clinical assessment, as evidence that she did. This is the specific mechanism, and it's worth naming it plainly because it shows up in the documentation of so many institutional cases of this era, by which an initial, possibly well-intentioned commitment for a short-term evaluation became a permanent one. The patient's own awareness of her situation, her own insistence that she was not ill and did not belong where she was interpreted by the institution's diagnostic framework as a symptom rather than as accurate self-knowledge. Edna Marsh told the staff at Coldwater she shouldn't be there. They wrote it down as proof that she should be. By the end of 1941, 9 months into her commitment, Edna's file shows a classification change from short-term evaluation to indefinite residential placement. She was 15 years old. Now, before we continue, I want to make sure you understand the full weight of that phrase. Indefinite residential placement. In 1941, for a 15-year-old girl in a state hospital. Let that sit for just a moment, because everything that follows flows from that single administrative decision made about a child who had done nothing wrong, lost nothing, except her father, and come from a mother who had signed one piece of paper without understanding what it meant. There was a woman named Sister Margaret Connell, one of several Catholic sisters who worked as volunteer visitors at Coldwater through a local diocesan charity program in the 1940s, who made regular rounds through the institution's younger female wards, and who encountered Edna, by her own later account, sometime in early 1942, a few months after that classification change. Sister Margaret kept a personal diary throughout her years of volunteer work at Coldwater, a diary that survives today because she donated it to a local historical society before her death in 1978, without any specific instruction about its contents, and that lay largely unread in that society's collection until a researcher working on Edna's case came across it in 2001. The entries that concern Edna span a period of roughly 3 years, from early 1942 through late 1944, and they represent, alongside Patricia Greaves's 1999 interview with Edna herself, the most intimate surviving window into what Edna's early years at Coldwater actually looked like from the inside. Sister Margaret's first entry mentioning Edna, dated February of 1942, describes her simply as a young girl, perhaps 15, very self-contained, watching everything carefully, the way children do when they are trying to understand a situation that doesn't make sense to them. Subsequent entries describe a gradual, cautious friendship developing between them over the course of that year's visits. Edna initially reluctant to speak much, then gradually opening up, telling Sister Margaret about her father's death, about her mother, about the brothers she missed, about the school she'd been taken out of mid-year. Sister Margaret's diary entries from this period record, with evident distress, a girl who was not displaying any behavior she could recognize as genuine psychiatric illness, a girl who was grieving, frightened, confused, and desperately homesick, but in ways that struck Sister Margaret, who had spent years doing this kind of volunteer work, as entirely consistent with the situation Edna was in, rather than as evidence of any underlying condition. I find myself wondering, Sister Margaret wrote in an October 1942 entry, what exactly it is that keeps this child here, because I cannot, after 8 months of visiting her, identify it myself. She is sad. She misses her family. She is in a place that frightens her, and that she does not believe she belongs in. These seem to me to be appropriate responses to her circumstances, not symptoms of them. I have spoken to one of the ward nurses about this, and the nurse looked at me the way nurses look at well-meaning outsiders who do not understand these things, and I am not certain she is wrong to, but I am not certain she is right either. Sister Margaret's visits eventually stopped in late 1944, for reasons her diary doesn't fully explain. A single entry from December of that year mentions a reassignment of my charitable duties by the diocese, without further elaboration. She and Edna apparently did not see each other again after that, and there is no indication in either the diary or Edna's own later recollections that Edna was ever told why the visits stopped. They simply stopped, the way Vera's visits stopped, the way the letters eventually stopped. One more connection to the world outside severed, as if the institution, without any single deliberate act of cruelty, simply had a kind of natural gravitational pull toward isolation, pulling people who'd been admitted further and further from everything they'd known, until the outside world became, first, something they rarely thought about, and then, something that existed almost exclusively in memory. Edna's life inside Coldwater settled, over the following years, into the rhythm that life at institutions of this kind always settled into. A routine of ward chores, meals, occupational therapy work that was, in practice, largely unpaid institutional labor, and the long, structurally empty stretches of time that defined daily life in a facility that, however it characterized itself on paper, had very little actual treatment to offer most of its patients. She worked in the hospital laundry for a period of nearly 12 years, by the records, an assignment that, like so many patient labor assignments of this era, was characterized as therapeutic while providing the institution with a significant practical benefit at no additional cost. What makes Edna's case both typical and, eventually, extraordinary is what happened to her correspondence with the outside world in those early years, because it's in the letters, or more precisely, in what happened to the letters, that the story's real mystery begins to take shape. Vera Marsh, Edna's mother, wrote to Coldwater repeatedly in the months following the commitment, asking after Edna's condition and when she might come home. The surviving institutional correspondence file shows that Vera received responses, brief, form-like letters from administrative staff describing Edna as receiving appropriate care and not yet ready for release evaluation. The file also shows that Vera's requests for visits were, in the early years, approved. She made at least 4 documented visits to Coldwater between 1941 and 1944, the last one recorded in October of that year. After October 1944, there are no further documented visits from Vera Marsh. And here is where the mystery, the title of this video refers to, begins to deepen. Researchers trying to reconstruct why the visits stopped have found, in Edna's own account given decades later, and in what limited documentation survives from this period, 2 different and partially contradictory explanations that have never been fully reconciled. Edna, in her 1999 interview with Patricia Greaves, described her mother's visit stopping as something that happened gradually and then completely. Fewer letters through the late 1940s, then none at all, and when she asked staff about her mother, she was told, first, that Vera was unwell, and later, that her family had moved and contact information was no longer available. What the institutional records show, however, is that Vera Marsh did not move until several years after the visits stopped. She remained in western Pennsylvania, documented in census records, until at least 1951. A single internal memo found in Coldwater's administrative files, dated November 1944, 1 month after Vera's last recorded visit, references, without naming any patient or family, a family contact situation requiring guidance, involving a long-term patient in one of the younger female wards, recommending a gradual reduction in correspondence facilitation as a matter of patient management. It is impossible to say with certainty whether this memo refers to Edna's case. It is equally impossible to say it doesn't. Vera Marsh died in 1959. If she ever tried to petition for her daughter's release, no record of that petition survives. Whether she knew, in her final years, that Edna was still inside Coldwater, whether she looked for her, whether she believed her daughter was still alive, the surviving record does not say. It is one of the questions Edna herself, by Greaves's account, found hardest to sit with in the years after her release. Not anger exactly, just a quiet, persistent wondering that 57 years of practiced institutional acceptance had not entirely extinguished. Before we get to that mystery, though, I want to stay a little longer with what Edna's middle decades actually looked like. Not the dramatic bookends of her story, the commitment at 14 and the release at 71, but the long, quiet middle that comprised the overwhelming majority of her life. Because that middle is, in some ways, the hardest part of her story to fully reckon with. By 1955, Edna Marsh was 28 years old and had been at Coldwater for 14 years. The world she'd been committed from in 1941 had, by 1955, transformed almost beyond recognition. The war had been fought and won. The economy had rebuilt itself. Television had arrived in most American living rooms, and the town she'd grown up in had changed in all the ways that towns change over a decade and a half. None of this reached Edna with any particular clarity. She had limited access to newspapers and radio, the way patients at institutions of this kind typically did, and what she knew of the outside world filtered in through the kind of fragmentary, second-hand information that comes from staff who mentioned things in passing, from other patients whose own connections to the outside world were similarly attenuated, and from her own memory of a life that, 14 years in, was already beginning to feel more like something she'd heard about than something she'd lived. A ward attendant named Thomas Breck, who worked at Coldwater from 1952 to 1967, and who was interviewed by the same researcher who found Sister Margaret's diary, remembered Edna during this period. She would have been in her mid to late 20s when he started, as someone you could easily overlook if you weren't paying attention, because she'd learned how to be invisible in the way long-term patients do. Not withdrawn exactly, just very quiet, very careful, like she'd decided a long time ago that the safest way to be in that place was to not give anyone a reason to notice you particularly. He also recalled that she kept, for a period he estimated as several years in the late 1950s, a small collection of objects on her bedside table: a comb, a small picture cut from a magazine, a smooth stone she'd apparently found in the yard, that she arranged and rearranged with obvious care, the way people do with the things that make a space feel like theirs. When the ward was reorganized in 1961 and patients were moved around, Breck said the stone went with her. He thought she still had it, years later, in a different ward entirely. By 1965, Edna was 38 years old and had been at Coldwater for 24 years. The deinstitutionalization movement that would eventually, indirectly, contribute to the conditions that led to her release was by this point well underway nationally, but its effects at Coldwater, like at most large state institutions of this era, came slowly and unevenly. The population began declining through the late 1960s and 1970s. Wards consolidated. Staff familiar to long-term patients came and went. The physical environment of the building itself changed around them in ways that, for someone who had spent decades learning the geography of a particular place, constituted their own, small, repeated disorientation. Edna moved wards at least 5 times between 1941 and her release in 1998. Each move documented in her file as an administrative necessity of one kind or another, each one representing, for a woman whose entire world had contracted to the dimensions of a single building, a significant disruption of the only stability available to her. By 1975, she was 48 years old. By 1985, 58. Her file in these years shows periodic psychiatric evaluations, mostly brief, mostly concluding with language that, read carefully now, reveals more about the self-fulfilling nature of the system she was trapped in than about any genuine clinical assessment of her condition. A 1978 evaluation concludes, in its entirety, that Edna is stable, institutionally adapted, and not currently presenting acute symptoms, language that, while technically accurate, obscures the fundamental question nobody in that evaluation was apparently asking, which is whether the stability and institutional adaptation being observed were evidence of a condition requiring continued institutionalization, or evidence of what happens to a human being who spends 37 years in the same facility. She might have died inside Coldwater, Many patients did. But in 1992, a newly hired social worker at the institution, a young woman named Carolyn Oates, in her first year on the job, assigned to a case review rotation that included Edna's ward, pulled Edna's file as part of a routine review, and found herself, by her own account given in a 1999 interview, stopping completely on the intake paperwork from 1941. A 14-year-old girl. A 40-minute evaluation. A diagnosis of feeble-mindedness that, by 1992, had been not just abandoned, but formally repudiated by every professional and diagnostic standard in the field. An indefinite placement that had now lasted 51 years. Oates raised Edna's case with her supervisor, who advised her, by her own account, that cases of this duration were complicated and that she should focus on her current caseload. Oates did not drop it. Over the following 6 years, she has described this period in interviews as the most frustrating professional experience of her life. She pushed, filed paperwork, requested evaluations, appealed decisions, connected with a legal advocacy organization specializing in wrongful institutionalization cases, and eventually, in 1997, helped file a formal petition for Edna's review and release with the state board, the same kind of petition that nobody had filed on Edna's behalf in the 56 years since her original commitment. The review that followed was, according to legal documents filed as part of the process, relatively brief once it actually happened, because the clinical case for Edna's continued institutionalization, examined by reviewers with no stake in the institution's prior decisions, was essentially non-existent. The original 1941 diagnosis was clinically indefensible by any standard in use in 1997. No subsequent documentation in Edna's 56-year file established any genuine, ongoing psychiatric condition that would have justified continued commitment under any criteria then in use. The board's review concluded, in language that several observers described as notably direct for this kind of administrative proceeding, that Edna Marsh's continued institutionalization had no current clinical basis and authorized her release. She walked out of Coldwater State Hospital in the spring of 1998. She was 71 years old. She had been inside for 57 years, longer than most people's entire adult lives, longer than most marriages, longer than the careers of every doctor and nurse who had ever treated her. She had gone in as a child who had lost her father, and came out as an old woman who had lost, in the intervening decades, her mother, her brothers, every friend and neighbor she'd ever known, every street she'd ever walked down, every reference point to a life she'd been taken from before it had properly begun. I wanted to find what remained of Edna's story for myself. So I made some calls, reached out to the advocacy organization that had helped secure her release, and eventually connected with Carolyn Oates, now retired, who agreed to speak with me. I'm sitting here today in a small town not far from where Coldwater once stood. The building itself was demolished in 2003, and there's a community college on the land now, which is its own kind of strange thing to sit with. Carolyn Oates was generous enough to walk me through the years she spent fighting for Edna's release, and one thing she said has stayed with me more than anything else from our conversation. She said that the hardest part, looking back, wasn't the bureaucratic obstacles, though there were many. It was the realization, which came to her gradually as she worked through Edna's file, that there was no single moment, no single decision, no single person she could point to and say, "This is where it went wrong." It went wrong in 1941, with a 40-minute evaluation and a mother who didn't understand the paper she was signing. And then it went wrong again, quietly, every single year for 57 years, every time a file was reviewed and a box was checked, and nobody asked the question, Carolyn Oates finally asked in 1992, "Does this person actually need to be here?" Edna Marsh lived for 4 years after her release, in a supported community residence about 30 miles from the town where she'd been born. She died in 2002, at the age of 75. She never returned to her hometown. According to Carolyn Oates, she spent her final years learning, with great difficulty and great patience, how to do the things that most 70-year-olds have been doing for decades. How to choose what to eat from a menu, how to manage a small amount of money, how to make decisions about her own day. She apparently loved, in those final years, to sit by the window of her residence in the early morning, before the rest of the house was awake, and watch the street outside. Oates said she asked Edna once what she was looking at, and Edna said, simply, that she was looking because she could, because the window opened and the street was there, and nobody was going to tell her she had to be somewhere else. I'll leave you with this. Edna Marsh's case is not, in its broad outlines, unique. Researchers studying the history of wrongful institutionalization in America have documented dozens of comparable cases from this era. Individuals committed in childhood or early adulthood on diagnoses that later proved clinically unsupported, who spent decades inside institutions through the sheer accumulated weight of a system that, once it had classified someone as requiring permanent care, had almost no mechanism for revisiting that classification. What makes Edna's case stand out is partly the duration. 57 years is, by every account I've found, among the longest documented wrongful commitments in American institutional history, and partly the documentary completeness of her file, which allows for the kind of reconstruction we've been able to do in this video. But mostly, what makes Edna's story stand out, for me, is the window. A woman who spent 57 years in a place where she did not belong, who spent her final 4 years of freedom sitting by a window watching a street because she could, because the view was hers if she wanted it, because nobody was going to tell her otherwise. She was 14 years old when they took that from her. She was 71 when she got it back. And whatever else you take from this story, I think that's the part of it that should never, in whatever year you're watching this from, be forgotten. Thanks so much for watching. If this story moved you, stick around. There are more forgotten stories like this one, waiting to be told, and I'd be glad to have you along for the next one.